Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on treating APIs as products. My name is Ryan, and I'll be here to help facilitate today's webinar. Today, we're going to be driving into a 7-step framework for treating APIs as products, and we're going to really walk through workflow and best practices that your team can follow, as well as some live demonstrations. So I'm excited to be joined today by Keshav and Nathan. They're going to be really walking you through and diving into some of these demos.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ryan. And I'm Keshav, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. If I'm talking too loud or too fast or too slow, please do let me know and I'll adjust my pace accordingly. So in this entire presentation, the agenda which I want to follow is first, I want to articulate why it's important to even start thinking of APIs as actual products, not just technological artifacts, but more like a first-class citizen of your product portfolio. And from then on, I want to actually give you a framework of thinking on how to actually apply, how to actually start building APIs from a product management perspective, right? And the thing which I want to emphasize over here is this framework is not set in stone. There's going to be so many variables associated with this, like your company's culture, the number of legacy APIs you're building, you have, your future vision, the technological architecture which you're currently have inherited in your company. So there's a lot of different variables, but my hope is this framework grounds you into and inspires you to think in a certain way and in a certain direction. So without further ado, let's get started. So we're seeing right now that companies are entering this platform ecosystem, right? And there's a lot of companies, if you're following the news, you'll realize that there's a lot of companies out there which are opening up their existing platforms and opening up their data channels, really allowing people to start building on top of their existing services or their existing data. Almost every day, we're hearing new financial companies, healthcare companies, consumer-based media companies opening up their API, opening up their data, and really entering this platform economy. And it's interesting because one thing which we, I would say, the internet generation has not fully grasped or understood is just how much revenue platforms actually drive in the world. Like if you think about when the internet first came up all the way till the current stage, you'll realize, and if you actually map the amount of revenue that's been generated, you'll realize that the majority of the revenue that has been generated is actually through the platform ecosystems. Companies like Salesforce, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, they're all platforms at the end of the day. When I say platform, of course, they're just like essentially a product which has exposed their data in a way that allows you to extend on top of their existing functionality. And again, this data could be public, private, it's up to you. Like we have, for example, within our company, we have products which are platforms, but again, we don't have public APIs that expose them. We have private APIs that make this a platform, right? And they're really helping companies drive a lot of revenue. And all of this, as I mentioned, is being driven through APIs because, again, when you want to expose any sort of data and if you want to have any two logical units communicate with each other, it happens through an application programming interface. Programmable web lists that there's about, it's not 19,000, actually more than that. There's actually 60,000 plus public APIs available on programmable web. And like the number of internal APIs is actually much, much, much higher. There's like we estimate more than hundreds of thousands of internal APIs all working together to make applications work. So they're like this, and with the future revolutions like IoT, mobile, AI, everything's going to be driven through APIs. It's really important to start understanding that, you can no longer think of them as just code. So traditionally, there's always been this approach where, if you have this idea of an API and you're like, hey, I need to connect two different logical units, I need to make this faster, all right, let's just build an API, right? And developers would just go in and start building these APIs. And then, of course, there'd be a documentation writer. They have to write more documentation to understand how to use these APIs. There might be, say, a testing team involved to test these APIs. But again, it was a very linear path. And there was no real scoping on understanding, well, okay, I've connected these two units, but is there more to this? Is there is there a bigger and grander scope than what I've just initially assumed? So what I want to bring out the fact is, this approach will no longer work in today's scenario, especially given how hyper competitive and how hyper competitive the API economy is, and also just how how if APIs are driving revenue and strategic targets for your company, it's really important to not just think of this as, okay, let's just work on this, let's just get it out there. Because again, there might be lost opportunity costs, there might be lost revenue, lost potential, all of this involved when not following a product-based approach for developing APIs. So a product-based approach really is essentially treating APIs as first-class citizens of your entire product portfolio. Meaning, even if, say you're a product or a service company, even before you even build a product, first you start thinking about how you can expose the data to an API and then build your products on top of that. So for example, like in a very common approach, which a lot of people are following right now, is an API first approach, where once you understood like what the purpose of your product is, you actually start out by designing the API's interface first. So if you look at all the blue boxes on the screen, they're just API interfaces. They're not, and by API interface, I mean essentially just RESTful API designs. And we'll talk more about what it means to design an API. And there's no backend logic to this. There's just essentially a mock service that this API exposes. And what the cool thing is, once you have this this in place, your backend and front end teams can actually work together without any interdependency. So once you have an API layer or the interface that's exposed to a mock service, your front-end developers can start working on different clients. Your back-end developers can then start working on the implementation. And again, there's no interrelation. There's not a lot of dependencies between them, which allows you to move much faster, right? And also because you're designing the API interface first, you're putting your consumers' needs first. You're not just saying, okay, let's just build something out really quickly and get it out there. You're actually thinking, how do I best build and design an API that actually has value for my end consumers, which is really what a product manager would be thinking, right? A product manager would be thinking, well, how do I build a usable product, or how do I build a usable API? How do I make sure that whatever I'm building actually has long-term sustainability, that it actually solves an actual market need, be it internal market needs, like meaning inside your company itself, or like external outward facing market needs. And also, of course, you always have to justify to executives on like, what is the ROI for this? What is the reason why we're building this, right? So it's a very product management approach of building APIs in today's economy. And of course, there's a few benefits of treating APIs as first-class products. I think I've articulated a few of them, but this is just to summarize on the benefits. One is, as I mentioned, reduced interdependencies. So different service teams can actually work together simultaneously at their own pace without any sort of dependency. So for example, once you have your API mock and API interface in place, your documentation team can start working on the documentation of the API. The front-end teams can start working because you have the mock data that's being sent out. Your front-end teams can take that mock data and work on their specific views or clients. And of course, the backend team can start working on the implementation. So it's really like there's reduced interdependencies. And this reduced interdependencies as a byproduct results in faster development of services and delivery. And it's easier to expand to different interfaces, clients, and views, because again, like you're starting with the API layer. So because you're starting with the API layer, it's really easy, like because it's pure data and pure JSON, which can be consumed by so many different programming languages and interfaces. You can easily expand from one interface to the next or one device to the next. And finally, of course, like when you start treating them as first-class products, you're also always putting your consumer hat on. And when I say consumer, the end consumer of your API, be it a public consumer or like someone within your company itself. So you're always like having that lens on, or like, how do I make them reach success with my offerings in this fastest and easiest way possible? So building developer-friendly services to build ecosystems and platforms is a primary objective, and treating them as products will help you build easier and friendly services. So if this was like faster development, this would be for actually allowing you to generate new revenue and growth channels. So based on all of this information, and I hope I've articulated why it's important to start thinking of your APIs as products, especially given the numerous opportunity present in the market right now with through APIs. I've put together 7 steps on like how to actually start thinking about your API product management principles. Right, so it starts with understanding the API's target verticals all the way to marketing, and I'm going to be taking you through each of these steps. How we want to do this webinar is also like, I have my colleague Nathan over here, and Nathan will be talking through some of the places we'll actually be showing you a live demo on like how to actually design an API, how to actually iterate on the API. So there's sections where I'll be handing it off to Nathan, and Nathan will actually be showing you a live demo on all the information we've just shared with you. All right, so let's get started. So the step number one is understanding the API's audience. Who is it that you're actually building it for? This again it's actually interesting. Like as they speak to more and more customers, we've come to this conclusion, and this is validated by some of the other thought leaders and industry experts we're speaking with, is not a lot of people actually understand who their actual end target customer is for their API. Everyone throws around the word developer, but a developer of what? Which industry, which vertical, which horizontal are you targeting, right? So all of those things need to be anticipated. So it's, first of all, it's really important to understand, well, who are your direct customers, right? And this could be just having an incredible understanding of like if say for of your end consumers. So say for example, you're a company like Slack, right? And Slack we know is, and for people who don't know, Slack is a collaboration tool that allows people within companies to communicate with each other. Slack's direct consumers are, say, employees in a tech company, right? And and Slack knows that all these people, if they're using Slack as a mechanism to communicate with each other, there's also a need to be immediately notified of any new updates that have happened in their existing tooling ecosystem, right? So for example, when you're pushing new code, if you're using Slack already to communicate with each other, why not also have them get notified of like new push updates to their existing repos instead of going to GitHub, getting an email notification, etc. So now, now that you've understood the needs of your direct consumers, right, expose the right data and resources for the customers, right? So we just know, for example, in Slack that, hey, we know that these people want to get updates for, say, every time they push a new software code into their software platforms. So then it's just a matter of like, how do you expose the right resources and the right data to the right customers? And so this is the exposing the right resources to these customers. But also I want to mention that if you're putting on your product management hat, it's also important to look at other opportunities that exist in the market. Because again, a platform economy primarily is all about opening up different opportunities. So it's really important to anticipate and prepare for indirect customers that could benefit from some of the data you might be exposing, be it internal APIs or public APIs, and really just like take advantage of that and build up new momentum and opportunity. And I'll give you an actual real life example in the next coming slides. So how do you go about evaluating consumer needs? Well, it's really just the same exact principle you'd use when actually going about doing market research when building new products, right? So quantitative and qualitative research, there's like a lot of information how to construct good surveys to understand from a quantitative perspective where the market's headed, or like maybe internally you can do a few qualitative understanding of like your different teams, understand, what are the different bottlenecks that is preventing them from maybe releasing software faster, preventing them from from creating a better CI/CD pipeline, right? So all of them could be understanding that internal or external need is really important, and then understand. When I say competitive research, it's more about what are they doing right now to solve this existing problem. So they might be using a competitor, or they might just be winging it. They might have created their own little solution to make this happen. And of course, also understanding the geographic potential, right? So if you're evaluating consumer needs, the consumer's needs are going to be different in different ecosystems and different geographies. But the cool thing is, because APIs are just pure data, you can actually open up a lot of different geographical barriers to an API. So there's like real life examples where companies, if they want to get a foothold in a new country, for example, like say some country in Europe, they just release the API over there and start marketing it to developers so that developers can start building out services. And that way you don't need to actually establish a full-fledged marketing team to like build to raise awareness of the product. It's more organic and actually breaks up a lot of barriers. So it's really important to understand some of the consumer needs. If you remember one of the previous slides, I mentioned how it's important to also start thinking about indirect customers. Well, this is the actual real life example I want to bring up. I want to bring up the example of Yelp. So Yelp is actually a company that actually helps you know what are the nearby restaurants around you, and also gives you reviews from people like you and me, like regular consumers, who go in and eat and check out different restaurants. So they're not food critics; they're just like people, regular people, right? The average Joe, and they go in and they give different reviews. And so Yelp allows you to search by category of the type of restaurant. So, Asian fusion, Italian, different kinds of restaurant cuisines. It allows you to search by location. So if you're in Boston, you're in Philadelphia, and also you can actually search by their phone number as well. But so so they have an API that exposes all of this different data. Now, this can of course be marketed to the end consumer, but the cool thing is Uber, which is a ride-sharing app, which allows you to essentially, for people who don't know, Uber allows you to hail cabs from one location to the next. Actually can use this API, and they are, I think they've already started it. Essentially, when you go from point A to point B, Uber will give you recommendations on the best restaurants nearby, taking Yelp's API. So this way, you've actually created a new opportunity for someone like Uber, which is not direct, which is not necessarily a direct consumer of your API, but also but their end consumers could benefit from the information you're sharing. So it opens up a third-party avenue for partnership, maybe growth, and other strategic alignments. So the next step is, of course, understanding the API's purpose. Why am I building this API? So you've done your consumer research, you've done the important understanding, you've done the research, and now it's understanding how do you, what is the purpose of this API? So I always recommend a top-down approach when building APIs, meaning always understand the business need and the consumer need, right? So there's a consumer need, which is I have a problem to fix, and the business need, which is how is this going to translate directly to my business? And so both of them have to be really aligned. And when I say this, people might immediately think, oh, he's only talking about public APIs. That is not the case. A business need essentially could be anything from accelerating processes faster internally to getting some sort of revenue through exposing your data. So even, for example, connecting two internal applications together for some sort of accelerating a certain process is a business need, because that translates directly to some sort of tangible business outcome. So once you've understood this, you can start understanding, how are the different devices and applications that you want to expose this to, and that happens to an API layer. So you start from the business and consumer need and only then go all the way to the API layer. So, and there are real companies that actually take advantage of this, right? So they use APIs to do certain specific tasks. So companies like Facebook and Netflix and Amazon actually move much faster because of their API offerings. Netflix, for example, has a very prominent and famous microservice architecture, which they use to essentially allow you to so the reason why you can binge on TV shows so quickly and you get the show in a matter of seconds is simply because of how quickly Netflix allows you to stream, and that's also because of the robust microservice architecture which contributes to this. Facebook, Facebook is a great example of market penetration. So Facebook, with their identity API, has actually made a lot of these third-party applications dependent on them. Right. So what they've done is they've actually been able to not just make people dependent on them, but also use this API to move much faster internally, because all of their services are exposed through APIs. And the same thing with Amazon. In 2002, actually, Amazon was one of the first companies to actually say, we've got all of our internal teams and all of the different modular functions will be exposed through an API service layer. So this way, every single team within Amazon can actually communicate directly through an API. And this is great, because this is the reason why Amazon can directly go from one market to the next really quickly, even though it's such a huge, gigantic company, right? It's because of such a flexible architecture which they have internally through their APIs. And there are also companies which use these APIs, not as internal APIs, but to essentially allow you to create more revenue channels and growth. So for example, companies like Stripe. Stripe is a payment company, and they have a very, very solid API offering, which allows you to process payments through their API. Twilio is a telecommunication company, which allows you essentially to allow, for example, Twilio is used by WhatsApp, right? WhatsApp is one of the biggest communication method apps out there in the world. And every time you try to make a phone call through WhatsApp, it actually uses Twilio's API to do that. Shippo is a logistics aggregation company that gives you insights on different, logistic companies. So it's just these, and they monetize this. So these are just different ways in which they've monetized this. So, I've spoken about what it takes to actually, understand the API's target audience. And I've also spoken about what it means to understand the API's purpose. So we want to take a real life example. And this will be actually done by Nathan, and he'll also walk you through a certain demo sometime later. So I'll hand it over to Nathan right now.
Great. Thanks, Keshav. Once again, my name is Nathan. I work here at SmartBear as a sales engineer. At a very high level, the API that we're going to be talking about today and the design kind of approach that we want to take is going to fulfill a very strict set of requirements. Essentially, we have an HR department internally, and they're building out some kind of new app, mobile app, something like that. And with that, we want to be able to add, remove users from the database through a revamped API. Maybe it's a RESTful service that we're moving away from, a SOAP service that was traditionally there. So at a very high level, these are the requirements that we have. Essentially, we need a way to retrieve as well as submit new data into the database. That's going to be handled through the API. And we want to break down the users who are going to be creating this, designing it, developing it into three categories. We're going to have our API architects. These are probably the highest level of API designers. So, we have read-write access for them. They would maybe create like a very high level structure for the API, the paths, the resources that we want to utilize. The development team is going to take that Swagger definition, potentially write code against it. Maybe there's some kind of integration. Maybe you could talk, and I think we'll get into this later, the ability to stand up a mock service based off something like a definition file. And then potentially the QA team. We have a lot of people these days who are talking about, test-driven development, behavior-driven development. Handing off something like a definition to a testing team will give them the ability to essentially fulfill tests for those requirements before we actually develop an API. So in line with the development process, we could be using that test to essentially validate what's being created. So there's a lot of reasons that we want to create this and start from a Swagger definition. Keshav, do we want to talk about SwaggerHub itself, or are we going to save that for a little bit later?
No, we'll save that for later.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, thank you so much for that, Nathan. So now that we've touched on understanding the API's target consumer and also the API's purpose, let's go into step number 3, which is we've done all the planning. Now let's start actually building this API. So one of the things we advocate for in the product management approach is really starting with the design of the API first, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Primarily, it's simply because of the fact that APIs touch on so many different people. And people make up your business, and people make up your consumers, right? And it's really, and APIs primarily, if you think about it, they're just code. It's like a black box of sorts. So when you actually start out with the API's design, and I'm saying, and it's titled RESTful Interface, but think of the interface as the design as well, is you're starting with the design, and what the design or the interface does is that it actually models out what is the API's resources that you're exposing, and also the request and response cycles that are associated with each of these resources of your data. And now this is just pure design. And what I mean by design is you're just describing what these different artifacts are. You're not actually creating any sort of code in the back end. You're not actually building out any sort of business logic. It's just purely talking about what are the resources, what are the requests, and what are the responses. And once you have this API's design in place, it actually acts as a contract to keep all of these different stakeholders in sync internally. So the people who build this API. So your architect knows what this API does. Your developer knows what are the different request and response cycles associated with each of these resources. And so the developer can go in and start writing business logic associated with that. Your technical writer can actually start writing comprehensive documentation so that end consumers can easily understand how to use this API. And finally, your tester can start writing test cases against all of these different methods, because again, the contract or the design keeps all of them in sync and also reduces any sort of dependencies, but also any sort of doubts in their minds. But the other thing, as I mentioned, your business is also made up of the people who consume your services. And so with this RESTful interface, you're actually, when you design this API from the start, you're actually putting your consumer hat on, and you're actually you're trying to design something which will actually add value to your end consumer. So trying to make your service as easy as possible to actually be consumed. Trying to make sure that all the resources you have, you expose, actually aligns with your target consumer's business or market need, right? So this way, this is kind of like a forcing function for you to actually start thinking about these big decisions early on. So as I mentioned, like design first and product management principles or treating APIs as products goes hand in hand. And what it does, like, as I mentioned, it puts the business objective of the API first. It puts the consumer first before you actually start building out the artifacts or the technology. And the OpenAPI specification has emerged as the world's standard when it comes to designing and developing RESTful APIs. A quick history, SmartBear is actually the company behind the OpenAPI specification. It was first called a Swagger specification, which I'm sure people here in the audience have heard of, right? And then SmartBear donated the Swagger specification in 2016 to the Linux Foundation, because we realized that there's so many people in the world who are actually using this the specification. So we wanted to standardize this, and we wanted to create an open body which allows for the development of the specification in an open and transparent manner. And so, we donated the specification, renamed it as the OpenAPI specification, and it's emerged as now the world standard, advocated by the Linux Foundation for designing and documenting RESTful APIs. So this, for example, is a RESTful API defined by the OpenAPI specification. Right on the top is the API overview, which gives you information on what this API does. Then you have a section which shows you the requests associated with that API. So you see the resource, and then you see all the requests associated with this API. And then finally, it's the response. And all the things I'm showing over here, the descriptions you're seeing, there's no code involved in this. This is just purely a YAML-based file that describes what is this that this API is supposed to do, what are the requests, and what are the responses. There's no business logic. There's no actual code. There's no actual, it's purely just human readable. But the advantage of the OpenAPI specification is also that it's machine readable, meaning this file can actually be consumed by tools, by third-party tools, applications, because it's fully machine readable. So from here, you could auto-generate documentation. You can create mocks. You can create monitors to monitor this API, right? All of this just from a single API file. So it's very powerful. Even though it looks extremely simple, it has such powerful implications in your API lifecycle. And this is, again, an example of the documentation I mentioned. So from the specification or the design which I showed you, you can auto-generate that beautiful documentation you're seeing on the left using a tool like Swagger UI, which is an open source tool, which a lot of people have already heard of. And so just from that simple specification file, or design file, you can do a bunch of different things in your lifecycle. So as I mentioned, right, it touches on different aspects. From using the Swagger tools, you can design, document, and develop APIs. You can create monitors, or you can create words to mock this API. And you can also do testing. You write test cases automatically from the API design itself. It touches on different aspects. But one thing, being part of the Swagger team, we realized is, designing APIs is incredibly hard, especially, when we're talking about this API economy. We're talking about how, we want to actually apply product management principles. We want to make sure that this API is sustainable and lasts for like a really long time. This can be extremely, extremely hard. Right. One thing is, of course, like as a company grows and as the number of API offerings increases, it becomes incredibly hard to actually have a common vocabulary or a common consistency of design styles across all of these APIs. Right. APIs, again, they're long-term projects. Right. And, you don't want to keep designing and building and updating APIs all the time. So when you're starting out with the API itself, you always have to make sure that initially itself, there's some sort of common vocabulary which they follow, because, again, you don't want to go back 2 months later and update it, and then all of a sudden applications depend on the API breakdown. So consistent design styles during the collaboration and also during the consumption phase is incredibly important. Confusion when collaboration, well, every software team knows this, and this is no different in the API world as well. Now, GitHub, GitLab, they've kind of helped us collaborate on code to an extent. But again, API design is a different beast by itself, because you need to give that API design a first-class treatment. You need to see, okay, how does this API interface look like for an end consumer? You want to see if it complies with the latest standards of the OpenAPI. You want to see if it doesn't miss out on any of the common vocabulary or the common styles which you had enforced within your organization, right? So all of those things become incredibly important, which could lead to a lot of confusion. There's also loss of speed and time when iterating through design. Just based on point number 1 and 2, loss of speed is just such a common and given in the design phase. In fact, so many companies we've heard say, the design first approach makes a lot of sense, but it just makes us move so much slower. And finally, infrastructure costs associating with hosting the API, managing the API privacy, and giving the right people the right access, which is why we built a tool called SwaggerHub. Right? SwaggerHub is a design and documentation platform, and it's built by the same team behind Swagger. So the people who are using the specification right now, SmartBear built the original specification, and we also built SwaggerHub. The same team which worked on the main specification built SwaggerHub. And the goal was really, we've offered all these open source tools, and individuals love our open source tools. But again, for an enterprise, for a team, for a startup, when they're working together on the APIs and they want to actually achieve a business objective, how do we streamline that process in a way that gives them the maximum value in the shortest amount of time possible? Which is why SwaggerHub came into existence. SwaggerHub allows you, with some of the features, and Nathan will touch on a few of them in the demo, will allow you to actually create design in a consistent manner, but without any loss in speed. Meaning we have certain features that allow you to actually design faster while simultaneously keeping that consistent styles, as I mentioned, keeping that consistent vocabulary across all of your teams. Confusion-free collaboration. So, we have features that allow you to actually create a review process. Every time you add a new change, it actually can go through a review and you can pick out what changes need to be added so that there's no breaking changes introduced into the API. There's a communication mechanism within SwaggerHub that allows different teams to communicate with each other, create issues, and resolve them as a team. Communication is of utmost importance that leads to the success of any organization, and API teams are no different. And finally, we provide an out-of-box centralized API catalog, because again, you don't want to be building things which no one wants to use, or no one can discover where these things are to even want to use, right? So SwaggerHub, we've actually provided a central API catalog for all of your teams to come in, search for the right APIs at the right time, and start consuming them, because again, documentation is all hosted on SwaggerHub, interactive documentation. So all of your teams can discover these APIs anytime and anywhere. And a product strategy we've adopted, which is completely different from, I think, some of the other, I would say, the existing tools, is that we always want to be flexible. We only want to do design and documentation, and we want to give you the flexibility to integrate with the best of breed tools out there, like GitLab, Bitbucket, so that way you can take SwaggerHub and let it be your source of truth for the API definition, and then allow you to sync across different aspects of your API lifecycle. So I'm going to send it back to Nathan right now, who's going to be giving you an overview of the design we're going to be creating.
Yeah, absolutely. So just bringing it back again to this HR API that we kind of laid out our requirements for. This is kind of the baseline function, maybe let's say version 1 functionality that we want this API to support. Essentially, we're going to have a single resource path. It's going to be /users. There's going to be 2 methods. As I mentioned, we want to be able to retrieve as well as submit new data into the database. This is going to happen through a get action or a post. This will essentially map to a handful of different responses, not even a handful. We have a 200 for the response for when a value is being returned from the database. We've got a 200 for when something is stored successfully. It'll look slightly different. And then in the center, we have a 404, and this is something that's going to be shared between both of these different methods. We'll introduce the idea of having this shared element of being able to reuse things, and I think Keshav's done a great job of explaining why this is really important, having this single source of truth that's kind of utilized across all of our potential API designs. So I think that we're just going to jump right in and start showing off the editor, start talking a little bit about how we actually create one of these Swagger definitions and some of the functionality that we offer with a tool like SwaggerHub. So I should just be able to take the screen rights. Great. So for anybody who hasn't seen it before, on the screen we now have SwaggerHub. As Keshav mentioned, this is designed to solve some of the issues that come up when teams start to use definition standards at scale. Now, I don't want to, say that there's no reason not to use the open source. We see plenty of people using open source offerings in conjunction with something like SwaggerHub. But when we start to think about some of the issues that might happen as the adoption grows, as we mentioned, reusability, having a maintainable or single source of truth that everyone's looking at, collaborative efforts, being able to communicate back and forth within a single place as opposed to having a million different email chains and Slack messages. That's really where we see SwaggerHub coming in. In our case, we're going to try and keep it as kind of straightforward as possible. So let's just go ahead and we'll create a new API. A tool supports a number of different starting points. In our case, we'll just use an empty template, and let's give this a clever name. Now, what's going to actually happen here is we're going to create a new API definition inside of the SwaggerHub repository. So there's a database that lives behind here. What this is going to do is it's going to map a specific location to that definition file. So as we do things like create new versions, as we add new members and teams, we're really just mapping them to the path that we created when we set this up. And we should be able to see that as we kind of move through here. So let's go ahead and create this. Let's call it something brand new. There we go. So we saw some screenshots. We should see in just a second the kind of live tool here. And it's essentially split into two hubs. On the left-hand side, we have the editor. This is where we're going to build out that YAML file that we've been talking about. But the nice thing is on the right-hand side, we actually have live documentation being generated. So when we do something like add a new path, which we know is going to be users, we should see that we update our documentation to reflect that. So now we have a single method within here. We have this that we can open up. If we had any kind of parameters, responses, those are all going to start to be rendered out. But immediately we can start to get an idea of what that API consumer, the person who's going to be utilizing this, what they're actually going to be able to do with this API and how they're going to be able to consume it. We see the documentation that they'll be using. When we think about this at a larger scale, things like descriptions and summaries, something that often gets overlooked, but is really important for that person who's, just coming to this as a static page. They're just looking at, the documentation. They need to understand how to use it. I'm sure everybody's read through some terrible API documentation. So being able to, again, tie everything together to a single definition that is going to be handed off to documentation, testing, development, it becomes even more powerful. Now, in our case, we have created the single method that we needed. We'll fill this in a little bit in just a second, but let's go ahead and create another one at the bottom here. And while we do this, I want to just point out one of the nice features within SwaggerHub. It's this autocomplete element. So as we start to implement new features, functionality, we're going to be looking at doing this within the Swagger specification. By nature, it has a set of rules. So the things that we create, the things that we type and we store in these definition files, they have to adhere to a certain standard, to a structure. It's kind of a pain to have to read through documentation, flip back and forth every time we enter a new value. Now, the tool is going to do a really nice job of actually feeding in things like snippets and precompiled objects. So if we want to add a new post method, I know exactly what values we need to make this a valid Swagger definition. Now, the other thing that we see on the right-hand side, or sorry, on the left-hand side, the tool is actually giving us feedback when we generate errors. So if we have an issue with what we're doing, if we're not familiar with Swagger, again, we're going to get a very explicit error telling us what we need to change in order to essentially make this valid and be able to push it on to the rest of our tool. So to save everybody who's watching me type this out, let's go ahead and copy paste some of this information over. And then we'll just go through and talk a little bit about what it actually is that we've kind of imported here. There we go. So we still only have the two methods shown on the right-hand side, but what we've done, we've actually built out the actual functionality of what we intend the functionality of the API to be. We can see that we have the description right up at the top. This is going to be shown to the user when they open up any of these. But we also have the required or optional parameters available against this API. So this is, again, going to be tied to this definition, which is going to get passed down to all of the different consumers. But as an end user, I can see immediately what I need to be able to submit to this API in order to get some kind of response from it. When it comes to the responses, those are the next section right down at the bottom. In our case, we have the 200 defined right here, and we can see that that's rendered out. And I think one of the really nice things, it's not just telling us that status is an integer, that the UUID is a string. It's actually plugging in example values. So if we have something like a very specific date time structure, we have something like a user ID that comes in a very specific format, as opposed to just describing that and hoping everybody reads, a subtext of how that's going to be created. We can actually map out an example so people will be able to very quickly see what the API is going to be able to consume. And this is really going to ease a lot of the integration troubles that might stem when working with some kind of microservice structure. As we can see with the post method, very, very similar. We've also included now the definition of what should be in the post body, including example values, for instance, our date time. This is something that's going to be read by the API and should come in a specific format. And we can actually see that now within the tool. So there's a lot of reasons why we'd want to include this kind of information. And it's not just for the documentation, but actually when we're building this out, it's going to define how the API performs.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Mhm.
Let me just take it back to my screen here. Yep. So as Nathan mentioned, we actually showed you a live demo of not just the whole understanding the business purpose and the target audience, but actually taking that real life example and actually showing the actual design on a tool like SwaggerHub. So now let's go into the next phase of this, which is identifying the metrics of success. So you've designed this API, and the whole point of going with the design first approach is not just having your consumer hat on and getting them to forcing you to create an API that actually matters, but also essentially getting that early feedback, right? So you can actually build a successful API. But to even get that early feedback, you need to know what are some of the key points or data points that you actually want to measure. So it's really important to choose the right KPIs, but choosing the right KPIs is hard. There's so many different KPIs you could be using, and it just becomes a mess if you don't know what you're trying to do. So that's why I always recommend take it back to the purpose of your API. Why did you actually build this API? Once you understood that purpose, it's very easy to map out and find out the right KPI for your API. So metrics that matter, right? So there's, business goals and consumer essentially alleviating the consumer journey. And business goals, again, when I say business, it doesn't always mean public API. Internal APIs as well have a business goal associated with that. So it's always important to remember that. So have a business goal in mind and also understand the consumer journey. So some of the business goal metrics, right? If your API is public, this way there could be something like Twilio or SendGrid, and they monetize their entire platform through an API, then the direct monetization, which is an increase in MRR, or monthly recurring revenue, is something which measures the success of your API. If, say, for example, it's an API which is free, but essentially the strategy is to grow, and the purpose you want to build out that API is to get people using and the applications dependent on your API, then the KPI could be potentially the number of new customers or new applications that have come in and have started depending on your data through the API. So Facebook actually and eBay, they've both grown tremendously through the API offerings. In fact, eBay was one of the first companies to even offer a web API back in 2003, I believe. And finally, package monetization. So, customer, essentially Salesforce and even Atlassian does a good job of this. They expose the data and allow third-party developers to build functionality and applications on top of that. And essentially they monetize this. They've essentially you can actually pay additional fees to get these applications. And I believe the people who've helped build those applications get a cut of that as well. And so the way you can essentially measure the success of this program is by looking at the customer lifetime value of people who've used that API application versus people who haven't, right? So this way, understanding the business goal metrics is really important. And of course, if it's, you also need to know, even if maybe you're solving this issue, but you also need to understand, how the people coming into this API, right? So understanding the entire audience journey is extremely important. And so essentially going all the way from how does the user come in and discover the API, get the API registry key, all the way to whether or not they want to be sharing this API with others. And if you look at all of these things, they can all be measured, right? So time to obtain and register, get the API key, time to get the first 200 value, time to the number of calls the user is making, finally, whether or not the user is sharing or not. And sharing is a hard thing to measure, but the first three things was very, very easy to measure. And so based on that, you can actually create some recommendations on how to improve certain flows, right? So say, for example, the time to hello world or the time the first 200 is taking a lot of time, that means the documentation has to be improved. That's just an example. And then once you've understood this, it's time to get some feedback, right? So products evolve with good feedback. So it's really important to find the right channels early on. So, you need to like show this to the developers who matter, so your target audience. And so maybe show to existing customers, you have your design in place, show this to maybe organize a hackathon and get those developers into your system. But then from here on, it becomes incredibly important to get that feedback early on. And once you get that feedback, you iterate on the API, right? You get that feedback and you build on top of your existing services. So I'm going to give it back to Nathan, and Nathan's going to show how you actually mock out this API, and then taking that mock, you can share it with others, and then potentially from then on iterate on the API.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the coolest things about the idea of having a definition, that we can plug this into something like a mocking tool, be it within SwaggerHub, be it something a little more expansive, like what we offer in some of our other tooling. But this then we could actually share around, as Keshav mentioned, with API consumers, with people who are building integrations. They can start to give feedback, and we can start to implement those changes within the design before we actually write any code. So something that, again, is going to give us a much better product at an earlier stage than if we deploy something after months and months of development and we start to get feedback that it doesn't really work great for the intended user. So we're back in SwaggerHub here. Again, we have the definition on the left, the documentation on the right. And what we want to do now is that we actually want to have this quote unquote API start to respond as if it was live, as if we'd written the code to fulfill these functions. Now, we can do this with SwaggerHub through an integration that we offer. When we open up our integrations menu, we have what we call an auto mock feature. Very straightforward. We essentially just define the name for the mock. If we had any kind of security layer, we would go ahead and add that in. But through just a few clicks now, we can see that behind the scenes, we've stood up this mock service. It's given us some new functionality in our actual documentation so that we can actually open this up, and you should have seen a little try it out now button. Let's just open another one of these up. Here we go. So just jump into a new definition here. But we can see now in our documentation on the right-hand side, we have this button that says try it out now. When we click this, it's actually going to give us a field for any kind of required parameters. It's really going to give the end user a very clear idea of what they need to input. But not just on the request side, it's actually going to execute this request against a mock service and return something. So we can see here that we actually got a response from this API. It's including our example values, our example data. And this we could potentially do not just from within this documentation, but we could go ahead, we could make a request against this from maybe another browser window. Maybe we want to do this from the command line to test out some different integrations that we might offer, or we might want to build out. Even if we just want to start to pass these values, these objects into something else, into our testing framework, something like that, build some assertions against these templated values, all different avenues that we could start to go down now with this mock service. So a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways that we could build on top of this. Now there's no logic here. There's, based on the ID I put in, it's always going to return the same thing. So this is a very kind of entry-level set of mock services, but we saw how easy it was to create. It's tied directly to our definition. So as you make changes there, the mock service will be updated. So a really nice way, again, at a very early stage to start to get some feedback. Okay, Shav, do we want to talk about commenting or anything like that?
Yeah, you can probably just like show a comment and
yeah. So within the tool as well, within SwaggerHub, there is a commenting system that we've built out. And this is going to allow us to actually create a conversation around a specific element. Some people see this and they think, well, it's just a comment on a line in a code document, but this is actually going to tie it to the object, to the response, to wherever we're placing that comment. So maybe we have this 200 response that we think is not really built out enough, or we need some new descriptions for, or something like that. We can select it. We can start to leave a comment here, tag users, that kind of thing. Everyone's going to get an email. And it's going to be stored within the tool. It's also going to be stored at a specific location. So if we needed to come back here, if we've added some new information above this, it's all going to be pushed down to be in line with where we initially added it, which in this case is a 200 response. So just a really nice way to go back and forth again within the document, tie it to the objects that we're creating, tie it to specific users, and essentially have this level of traceability. So as we resolve these, as they get kind of pushed away, we still have this conversation stored in the background. So if we did need to go back and look at who suggested what changes were made when, that information is living in the back end of the tool here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan, for that. So we'll just go back to our final step, and I'm going to rush through this because I know this is probably not the most relevant for target for the current people in the webinar today. The next step, once you've iterated, once you've got the feedback and really built out that API, is to market this API. And again, this is more of a marketing conversation, of course. If there's any product marketers or demand gen folks on the line, this might be helpful. But I'm going to quickly brush through this. So, understanding the API's positioning based on all of the research you've done in the start, understanding the audience and the purpose, and all the feedback as well, you should really get out a strong positioning of the API, which is then where you take the messaging and translate that across different web channels, right? Because primarily your API is going to be consumed online. So websites, dev portals, webinars, and finally through the API documentation itself. So all of them are part of the marketing efforts to actually promote the use of this API. And there's some companies which have done a great and phenomenal job with their inbound marketing, right? So these companies, for example, they have great dev portals. Once you come in, you know what this API is supposed to do, or also you have great tutorials to just tell you how to use those APIs as well, like quick starter guides and SDKs out of the box. So they're just really helpful in terms of marketing. And of course, then marketing, outbound marketing, developer evangelism and advocacy. This is actually a big thing in the tech space right now. And a lot of more companies are hiring for this. So it's someone with a mix of really strong technical skills, but also someone who can also articulate the value of those technical concepts. Nurturing and building a solid community, and also always promoting hackathons allows you to just nurture that developer community which you've garnered, which you've gained, and just build out a solid following for your API offering. So just a final summary on what we've just covered. I know we covered a lot of different topics over here. We've shown you demos as well. But essentially, my hope is you take away the fact that APIs are really important right now. As we're moving towards a future where multiple devices are going to be talking to each other and the world is going to be much more connected, APIs are going to probably be the most pivotal piece of software to have existed to drive the future we're going to be seeing. So it's really important to have a solid understanding of how APIs can drive business and technological goals. And my hope is that the 7 steps that you see on the screen can actually help you ground your development process and build an API that everyone loves. So I'm going to hand it back to Ryan, and we can open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a good amount of questions here, so we'll do our best to get to as many of these questions as we can. I want to let everyone know that I did just launch a poll within the webinar interface. If you are interested in learning more about SwaggerHub, feel free to fill out that poll, and we'll make sure we have additional information. One of the first questions that came in earlier in the webinar, and you touched on it a bit, is what is the overlap? Sorry, I think we had some audio problems there. What is the overlap between an API product manager, someone involved as an API product manager, and the architect? Is the product manager just focusing on reviewing, specifically when it comes to API design? Are they just reviewing, or do you see kind of a relationship between the two of these different people?
Great question. I think they're both, in my head at least, I would say they're kind of different parts of the same puzzle. A product manager for me is someone who is more, I would say, making sure that the API processes are all aligned and in place, that you're actually delivering the API in the right timelines, kind of like project managing the entire process, and also making sure that the delivery, the API actually is trying to achieve all of its business goals, right? And articulating those business goals to the right executives, to the right senior management, right? You essentially account the person in charge of that entire API program. An architect for me is someone who's working very closely with the API product manager, but taking all of those business objectives, taking all of the actual company the goals, and converting that into something which is more tangible for the development team to start working on. So there's like a very tight relationship between them. But I think the product manager is more than just reviewing the design. He's probably part of that process, but the architect would probably have a bigger say in the design in that specific phase. The product manager, I would feel, has more say on like towards is the API actually solving the specific market need that we've had in place. So those are some of I would say that's how the relationship would work. I don't know if Nathan has a different opinion.
No, I would agree. The product side of things, evaluating the market, translating that into business goals or what the API should be doing. And then we have this side from architecture where it's taking those business goals and actually translating it into technical requirements and specifications. We talk a lot about shifting left, agile, methodologies. I've talked to a lot of people who are moving that kind of architecture element down to the actual developers and giving a lot of freedom to the way that these APIs are created. But we need, at a high level, the goals and information to come from somebody. And, we do see kind of two sides to that coin.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Another question that came in was around publishing of the API in SwaggerHub. So I know we could, a lot of what we showed was maybe for more internal APIs, but how would that work for someone to actually publish their API if they're using Swagger for design documentation, but want to make it available to the public?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of options. One is within SwaggerHub as well, you can either create an API which is private or public. So if you want to create an API documentation or definition and use SwaggerHub to host that for the external world, you can create a public API. Automatically users will come in and can see the documentation. The cool thing is the documentation is interactive. So it's not a static documentation. Your consumers can actually try out that documentation before they integrate that into their existing code base. So that's one aspect. We also have an HTML generator out of the box. So essentially, based on your API offering, you can actually generate an HTML file that actually renders a beautiful document for your API offering, which you can then host it on whatever platform you want. And we give you full access to the HTML source code, any of the JavaScript associated with that. So you can like put in your own branding, your own animations, whatever you want, just post it on whatever server you feel most comfortable with. So that I think would be
Awesome. A question that came up, and actually said someone actually responded was interested in it as well, was around the idea of if you're using the OpenAPI specification around kind of globalization. So people have different languages and don't speak English. Have you seen like how people handle that at all?
Nathan, do you know?
That's actually a really interesting question I haven't come up with. I imagine that there's certain elements in there, summary, description, that kind of thing, that we could essentially translate or feed into some other API that's going to translate that for us. But I would think that the underlying structure and kind of definition would remain the same. So it's actually a really cool idea that we would have some kind of application that pulls in that Swagger definition, essentially converts a few of the elements into some other types of languages. And then this case I was just mentioning, output that in some different ways to act as documentation for all these users.
Yeah, and I think it has been posted on a GitHub repo as well. Someone has posted a question on this localization. I should check with the development team, like the product team leading the open source tools, to see if we're making any progress on that.
It's a really cool idea.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. I know we still have a lot of questions coming in, but we are right up against it here, so we are going to have to wrap up. We are going to be following up with a blog post on the Swagger blog. That's going to be answering some of the additional questions that came in, and expect to have that live on the blog this week. At this time, I am going to have to wrap up. I do want to say a big thanks to both our presenters and for everybody on the line. It was really, I think, a great presentation. I know we covered a lot. We will be working on getting the recording out to you, hopefully in the next 24 hours. So keep an eye on your inbox, and we'll get that out as soon as we can. So thanks again, and best of luck building the APIs with SwaggerHub.